Years old looking for the rapids, and there weren't any. And people from out of state would ask me, well, where are the Grand Rapids? And I'd say, well, we're working on it. And today we're going to find out more about that restoration project. I have two brief housekeeping matters. The first is I invite you all to turn down your phones because you don't want to be embarrassed when it rings. And I'll remind you to turn them back on at the end of the program. There are also a few question slips of paper for filling out questions on a few of the chairs throughout the auditorium. And you're invited to fill in some questions that you might ask on this topic of restoring the Grand River Rapids. Our speaker today is the illustrious Mayor, Rosalynn Bliss, and I was sent an amazing bio on Mayor Bliss. She is the first female mayor in the history of Grand Rapids, and she was not only elected in 2016 but re-elected in 2020. Mayor Bliss has undergraduate degrees in psychology and criminal justice, and she has her master's in social work from Grand Valley. She's very deeply involved in various boards throughout the western Michigan area, and she has a passion for children who are victims of child abuse, and that's just a very interesting topic, and I'm so glad that that's part of her dossier for today. At this time, I'd like to invite Mayor Bliss to speak and to show where the rapids are coming from.
Thank you. Hey. Thank you. I think I'm gonna hold this and move around a little bit because I've been in meetings all day so far. So it's nice to be standing and to be with all of you. And it's so good to be back in person. Yeah. My goodness, I have missed this during COVID. Zooms just aren't the same, are they? No. It's so good to be back together. And I get to talk to you about exciting projects in our city. So as Hank said, there really were beautiful raging rapids in our Grand River over 130 years ago. So back in the 1800s, we actually had these beautiful rapids in the heart of our city. And I'll flip through some pictures for you. The river was actually much wider than it is today, but we had these incredible rapids. And in fact, there are writings about the rapids, and they say that you could hear the rapids. They were so loud, you could hear them for almost a mile. And then, as many of us know the history of our city, we would have logs come down the rapids. And early in the 1900s, and I'd say late 1800s, it really started. We started to have all these furniture factories pop up on the east side and the west side of our river. And at one time, during the turn, right about the late 1800s, we had over 100 furniture factories lining the banks of our river, which is why historically we've been known as Furniture City, USA. And so here came the logs down our river, and you can imagine what happened. There were a lot of log jams. Oh, do I keep stepping in front of that?
That's okay.
Okay, well, I'll stand on one side for now and then maybe jump over there later. So we had all these log jams, and that was really the impetus for the beginning and the building of the dams, the largest one being the 6th Street Dam. So when you're downtown, that's where everybody gathers to fish, because what happens is, if it wasn't for the fish ladder, a lot of fish wouldn't be able to get above that dam. But the fish really collect there because the dam is so large. It's the largest. We have 5 dams altogether in the city of Grand Rapids. But the most interesting thing about our rapids is that it's incredibly rare in the state, especially lower Michigan, to have rapids this large. So in the heart of our city, in about a mile span, we have an 18-foot drop. And to put that in comparison, So you can see this up here. So that's the upper reach is what we call it. That's kind of up by Ann Street just to give you a sense of geography. So from kind of the northern part of Grand Rapids by Ann Street until you get to Wealthy, we have about an 18-foot drop. And then all the way from Wealthy Street all the way out to Lake Michigan, it's only about, which is about 40 miles by the way, it's only about a 4-foot drop. So it gives you a sense of how amazing they were. So the large dam went in first, then we had 4 other dams put in the river. We also had a lot of work on the banks of the river that actually made our river more narrow, and they brought in a ton of fill. And so parts of downtown actually used to be a part of the river. And then they brought in fill, and that's where even the convention center, where the convention center sits today, a portion of that actually used to be a part of the Grand River. So, back then they did a lot of work to create the river that we have today. The 4 smaller dams, so you have the 6th Street Dam, and then you have 4 smaller dams, and they were built, they're actually called beautification dams, which I find quite funny, because they were built because 100 years ago, we used to put a whole lot of sewage in our river, and it would sit and it would stink. So they wanted to kind of move it along. So they put in these kind of smaller, what we call lower head dams. But at the time, a lot of people referred to them as beautification dams, which I find ironic. So anyway, we currently have 5 dams. So here you can kind of see them. You can kind of see this is an aerial view of the river, and you can kind of get a sense of what we hope to do. So the intent, and it's kind of funny Hank brought this up, does anyone know how this project started? It started about 14 years ago. And the idea to remove the dams and restore the rapids to their natural state came out of a conversation between a couple of guys who were sitting at Founders having a beer and saying, where are the rapids in Grand Rapids? Like here you have a city named for rapids and they're nowhere to be found. And one of those guys, named Chip, said, man, do you think we could remove the dams and put the rapids back in the river? And that is the conversation that started this incredible $55 million project. Yeah, almost 14 years ago. So from that conversation, they pulled together other people and asked the question, can we remove these dams? Other cities all over the country are restoring their rivers and opening up their rivers and putting rapids back into rivers, and started having smaller conversations. Those conversations got bigger and bigger and eventually got to City Hall. I was a city commissioner at the time, so I was a commissioner before being mayor, and had served on this initiative called Green Grand Rapids, where we looked at how can we really invest more in greening the city, so everything from parks and trees and playgrounds and waterways and environmental sustainability efforts. And so I was serving on that, and so in our Green Grand Rapids plan, we put in a vision of restoring our rapids to their natural state. Then we started to go to Washington, D.C. We ended up working with a number of federal departments. We got designated as an urban waters project, which allowed us to bring in scientists to come and help do some of the initial studies of our river, because we had to decide a lot of different things. We had to determine, was there any environmental impact? Was there significant pollution in our river? What would the potential impact be on fish and wildlife? We did an economic impact study. So the first several years of this project, it was a lot of studying, learning from other cities, looking at other projects and how they were able to really come to fruition. But ultimately, what we ended up doing as this process moved down the road, we decided that if we're gonna be able to make it happen, we really had to separate it out into 2 different projects. So what you see before you is a kind of project plan. So down here, we call this the lower reach, and then we have the upper reach. So we have 6th Street Bridge up here. This is where the large 6th Street Bridge, 6th Street Dam is, or the fish ladder. And then these are where the smaller, kind of lower head dams are. So we have the upper reach and the lower reach. Lower reach is where you have the smaller dams. And there's a couple of reasons we did that. One, it will be easier to remove the lower head dams. They're smaller. There's a whole host of environmental reasons why we would want to start on the lower reach. But the big reason is that we found out that the 6th Street Dam, even though it was built to prevent log jams, over time it has become a de facto barrier for lamprey. So I've learned a lot about fish and wildlife since being a part of this project. And lamprey, if you don't know this, is a very invasive species. It's a parasite, it attaches to fish and it'll eventually kill them. So the 6th Street Dam is a lamprey barrier, and it prevents lamprey from swimming upstream and killing fish in the upper tributaries, which is really, really important for our fish and wildlife. So because of that, we had to start working with Great Lakes Fisheries around invasive species. So we have to, before we remove the 6th Street Dam, we have to build a hydraulic dam further upstream to prevent lamprey from swimming upstream. What we also learned through all of these studies is that we also have a ton of mussels in our river. A ton of mussels. And one of them, out of all the different types of mussels we have in the river, is called a snuff box mussel, and it is an endangered species. So we also have to work with the Endangered Species Department, and we have had to monitor, track, tag these mussels, thousands of them. Then we have to find a place to put them, and then we have to monitor them there, and then we have to move them back, and we have to monitor them some more. And we cannot have a negative impact on more than 20% of the snuff box mussels. So that's been fun to learn. It's only about $1 million to do all that, by the way. But these are the two projects. And so this is what we hope to accomplish. So a couple things just to kind of give you a big picture and let you know that we're working on all of the different aspects of this project. We know that it'll have an impact on fish and wildlife. In fact, the studies have come back very positive. Usually people ask me that. They say, what about all the fishermen? They're not going to be able to catch fish. What we know from our studies is that removing the dams will actually create greater oxygenation in the water and will actually be a better spawning ground and space for fish. It'll be more like their natural habitat and how the river was over 120 years ago. We also have looked at flooding. So as many of you know, we have huge flood walls along our river. We're hoping to make those more aesthetically pleasing, but also more natural as well. So we have been working with FEMA around flooding, so we've done all these flooding models. And then we also have obviously been looking at fish and wildlife and fish passage, recreation. Once the river is restored, people will be able to kayak and go canoeing and tubing, so we expect to have a lot more people using the river, which is great. And then we've also been working with our public safety department because at the city, our fire department, we have a river rescue team, so we want to make sure that we are prepared to be present and have skilled firefighters who will be able to help people if they're in distress. So lots of different moving parts on this project, but it's really exciting. The total for this project is about $55 million. We have raised all of that, so it's truly a public-private partnership. We've secured about $32 million from public funds, so both federal funds. We're working with Army Corps. The federal funds, they're going to pay for the hydraulic structure upstream. Army Corps engineers will actually build that. And then we've raised money from the county, the state, and private philanthropies. We've had a lot of donors in town that have contributed to this project. And this will give you just a little bit more about what we plan to do. You can see where we plan to remove the lower head dams, and then we're going to replace those with boulders that are exactly like the boulders that were removed from our river over 100 years ago. So we're really trying to take the river back to what it was, the natural state that it was. So it's a pretty exciting project. Here's some images of what we anticipate it will look like. So you can see that there are rapids and some boulders that have been put back in. And people will often ask me about safety. And putting the river back to its natural state is actually much, much safer for people who are fishing and who are in boats. Currently, and you may have seen this if you've walked along the banks of the river and looked at the dams. So where the dams are, when the water comes over, it actually creates a velocity and creates a circular motion in the water. So when people are in distress in the Grand River, it's typically because they're caught in one of those locations. Right after the dam, we have this really strong velocity of water in a circular motion, so people get pulled in and they can get caught in that space. So these dams are very dangerous for people, especially if they aren't wearing life jackets. So here's some more images of what we hope to do. This is further down by Fulton Street, so if you're familiar with this part of our river, there's a little bit of an island over there by Fulton Street, kind of by the old railroad bridge. So we're gonna actually invest in that island that's there, and people will hopefully be able to make it over to the island and enjoy that space. But you can kind of see what the river will hopefully look like, hopefully in the next 5 years. So then we are also looking at the banks of our river. So this project isn't just about in-river restoring the rapids, that's a big part of our vision, but we also have a vision for the river's edges. So we're really looking at this as an entire river corridor. So we identified a number of publicly owned sites along the river's edge that we hope to turn into park space, green space, recreation space, adventure space for kids. So this space is up on North Monroe, and some of you may remember this. This is the old water building. So if you remember, the building across the street was also part of our old water facilities, and then the big barrel that you see here was where we used to store water. It's now just a shell of a building, but it still looks like that. And right now we just park trucks there, we store dirt there, we store a lot of really ugly things. So it looks terrible. It's a terrible use of riverfront property. So our hope is to turn that into a beautiful park, and then this will be where the hydraulic structure is built, and then there will be a spot for people to put their canoes or kayaks in the water, or to actually portage around the hydraulic structure when it is in operation. So the hydraulic structure is basically a hydraulic dam that puts pressure in the water to prevent, so lamprey, the invasive species, they're really weak. We call them weak swimmers. They can't swim up stream very well. So you don't need a whole lot of velocity to prevent them from swimming upstream. So that's what this will be. So that's one site. Here's another site that we hope to redevelop. So this is the Cold Brook Edge site. So we've already done some work around this site. So this is where another old water building was, and then Leonard is right there. That's where our fire department is. And we hope to redevelop this entire site as well, and then to connect trails. So connecting the trails is a really big priority for us. Right now, there are a number of spots downtown where the trails don't connect. It's a handful, there's about half a dozen sites. But once we connect those trails from Leonard to Ann, that'll then connect the trail through Riverside Park, and then it'll connect us to the White Pine Trail, and that goes all the way up to Cadillac. So one of these days very soon, literally in the next 4 years, you'll be able to get on your bike or walk on the trail, and if you want to walk 80 some miles, you could go from downtown all the way to Cadillac on a non-motorized, very, very safe trail. So this is a wonderful addition. We did this trail connection that you see down here on Cold Brook. We did that about 2.5 years ago. We just got a $55 million allocation from the state to help connect the other trails. The trails that go from Leonard to Ann, they'll have to cantilever underneath the streets, so Leonard Street and Ann Street, so they're a little bit more expensive. The locations that are the last holdouts for our trail system are the most expensive, as you can imagine, right? We do the ones we can afford, and then the really expensive ones, they always get done last. So let's see here. So here is what we hope and what we envision along Cold Brook. So you can kind of see the difference. That's what it is today. This is what we hope it to be in the future. Let me show you some more before and after pictures. So this is North Monroe. So if you're familiar with North Monroe, this is right on the other side of the post office. So you have Spectrum Health is building on this part. You have, Icon on Bond and a few other buildings. It's a really large piece of land along the river that the city acquired about 4 years ago with money from the Michigan Trust Fund. And we intend to turn this into a huge riverfront park. And it should look like that.
Wow.
Yeah, what a transformation. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Here's another project that we're working on right now. This is also on the river's edge. So 201 Market is where the city has a lot of city operations. It's where the current big, huge salt pile is. So if you're driving down 131 or 196 and you see the salt pile, that's where this is. Our intent is to move off that site, move all of our city trucks and the salt pile off that site. And we plan to sell the site itself is 18 acres. It's a huge piece of land on our riverfront. Again, not the highest and best use to put dump trucks there and, snow plows there and salt. And so we plan to sell 11 acres of it to the Convention Arena Authority so that they can build a 12,000 seat outside amphitheater. And when the amphitheater is not being used, it'll be open green space, as you can see, and then you can see the trail that we want to do along the river's edge. Our intent is to have a beautiful trail system throughout our entire downtown on the east side of our Grand River, and then to cross over to the west side. So that's some of the big picture work that we're doing. Our primary partner in this work is called GrandRapidsWhitewater.org. They're a nonprofit organization. They've been helping lead the effort, and they're the ones that helped raise all the money. And there's lots of exciting things happening. So where we are in the process right now, we've raised all the money for both the in-river work and the amphitheater. Amphitheater is about $116 million. So similar to kind of what the Van Andel was 25 years ago when we built it. Van Andel was about $96 million. We've raised all the money, and we are in the permit process with the state of Michigan with Eagle. So if you're not familiar with Eagle, they used to be called the DEQ. They're the environmental agency at the state. So we've submitted all of the plans, and they are reviewing those. And as soon as we get the permits from the state, we are going to break ground, or as I always say, we're going to break water, and we're going to start these projects and hopefully have them done within 2 to 3 construction cycles. Just super exciting.
Wow.
Really, really exciting. So you'll start to see a lot of construction downtown, from the amphitheater to the trails to the parks, and hopefully very soon in the water, us doing the project. And how we do that, so if you are interested in construction and plans and how this is going to happen, what happens is you will build a temporary wall in the middle of the river, and then it will block off the east side of the river. So it's basically like splitting the river in half and diverting all the water to one side. So we'll work on the east part of the river, and then we'll flip that wall, and then we'll work on the west side of the river.
Wow.
So we'll divert the water from one side to the other side during the construction process. So that's the project. Yeah, and I'm a social worker, so I've learned a ton about engineering and wildlife and environmental studies and invasive species and eagle and you name it. It's been a really fun project to work on, and I'm hopeful that we'll be pretty close to done with all of these projects by the time I'm done being mayor. Yeah, so it's exciting. Yeah. So anyway, I'm happy to answer any questions about this project or other questions you might have on your mind.
Here, you can give it to Hank.
You want to give them to Hank?
Yeah.
All right.
We have the front lights, Jackie.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. So lamprey.
Why don't you start with that one?
Yeah. So as what happens to the lamprey we catch? So for the lamprey, it's interesting. We don't actually. So the invasive species department that we work with, they monitor lamprey. So they'll monitor how many lamprey are in the river, and lamprey have like a life cycle. And so the big thing is you just don't want them to get upstream. You want to stop them. There are lampricides, I believe are what they called, where you can actually kill the lamprey or the larvae of the lamprey. But typically they don't catch them to kill them, they catch them to study them. So their primary goal is really prevention. It's an interesting field. Like they know they're there. You can never get rid of them all. So it's just a matter of preventing them from getting up into other tributaries and then trying to minimize their impact on fish that are downriver. Yeah.
So they can't be food for anything.
They're not. You know what? I wish I should have put a picture up. They look like, so they're parasites. They look like skinny, tiny little suckers. Like they have a big
mouth.
They have a huge mouth.
Yes.
Huge mouth. And they basically, I've even seen a couple of the guys I work with from Canada who go out and do studies. When they catch a lamprey, they'll stick it on their head. And it leaves this like red mark where they suck. But they basically will attach and suck, and then they suck the blood and out of fish and they'll kill them. But they basically are like this long, skinny, almost like an eel. That's a great example, like an eel. Yeah, but smaller. They're like this big.
Came from the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah. Yep.
Hank can probably answer all those questions.
Well, there was a big lamprey crisis about 30 years ago.
Yes.
And many of them were controlled at that time. But
Yeah, and so the federal government, they put funds aside for lamprey prevention and mitigation. Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah, it's a good question. Part of the money that we've
Does anybody
raised.
have a verbal question you want to risk? Yeah, go right ahead.
That hydraulic dam that will be created, will that be electrically powered, or how will that work?
Yeah, it'll be hydraulically powered. Yeah, so the question is, how does the hydraulic structure work? So there will be, on each side of the river, there will be a control center. And it'll be monitored actually by the Army Corps of Engineers. But it's electrically powered, but then it creates this hydraulic velocity in the water to prevent lamprey from going upstream. But the nice thing about the dam, is it can be lowered or brought up when needed. It's not for flooding or water levels. It truly will just be used for lamprey mitigation.
But will it impact salmon?
No, it won't. Because it's really fascinating, they only use a velocity that is strong enough to impact lamprey, and salmon are actually really strong swimmers, which is why they can get up the fish ladder, right? And so the other fish will not have any issues getting past, but the lamprey will. And lamprey tend to be more prevalent during certain seasons. So when they're not running or they're not present, you won't have to have the same velocity. Yeah.
There was a question over here. Oh, yes.
What happens if we have rainy and a lot of snow and melt in the river?
Flooding.
Flooding.
Can they
So-
control that?
So we cannot do anything to the river through this project that will have a negative impact on current flooding levels. So that is why we're working with a team of river engineers, and they do what's called flooding models. So they'll do different types of modeling. So that we can't do anything in the river that will have a negative impact. Coupled with that, we still have to meet all of the FEMA requirements for flood walls. So right now, our flood walls that are built in the city are at a 500-year flood level. So they are taller than they've ever been. So FEMA changed the rules, 3.5 years ago. So we had to go in and actually increase the size of our flood walls. A couple spots, like Cold Brook, and then if you're familiar with the work we did next to Anabwin Park, we've started to, instead of just building straight up concrete walls, we started to build green, like levels, almost like a green stairway that still creates the same level of flood protection, but it's much more green, and it allows you to get down to the river and actually touch the river. So our philosophy around flood walls has changed as well. And we wanna make those flood walls where we can, like especially in these public parks that we wanna build. We want the flood walls to be more natural, like natural berms. They'll still have the concrete protection behind them, so we'll still meet all of the FEMA requirements for flooding and flood protection. But they'll be much, much more usable. So like when the river is at its normal level, you'll be able to go down and, spend time on one of the terraces, have a picnic, hang out, do whatever you want to do. Yeah, which should be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question.
You did not mention in your talk about an information site that's available for this project called GrandRapidsWhitewater.org. GrandRapidsWhitewater.org, that you can get on a mailing list for updates right to your own computer.
Yeah, and there's videos on there, and you'll find lots of information.
Over the years, there's probably been a buildup of sludge in the river, I presume.
You know what? That's
How
a
do
great.
you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question did we have a buildup of sludge in the river?
Right.
Surprisingly, our environmental study found little to no sediment and little to no pollution.
Wow.
And the reason I think that is because some of you may already know this. Under Mayor Logie, who is an amazing mayor of our city, so this was well over 35 years ago, under his leadership, a decision was made to invest over $300 million to separate our entire sewer system. So 35 years ago, our entire sewer system was connected. So everything went into the same pipe. And when there were severe rain events, you would have an overflow within our system. We didn't have the capacity. So the rainwater would impact the wastewater because it was all together. And so at our wastewater treatment facility, further down on Market, we would have what was called overflow events. And you'd have all this discharge of waste, sometimes somewhat treated, but still polluted waste, go into the river. And that is why, like 40 years ago, a lot of people were told, don't eat the fish in the Grand River. Like, it's not safe. How many of you have heard that?
Yep.
Yeah. So it was something, I still hear it sometimes today. People will say, can I eat the fish in the river? I'm like, yes, you can. So what happened is we invested over $300 million. We separated our entire system. We started with the worst parts of the city. And so over the last really 20 years, we have not been discharging hardly any waste into the river. Any untreated. All of it is treated and clean.
Wow.
So through the past number of years, because of the even with the dams, there's still as you all know, when you're out there, especially during heavy rain events, there's a lot of flow. Like, it's a very heavy flow, and the river rages. Like, it's a very fast moving river. Between how fast the river flows and the fact that we've done all this investment to prevent pollution from going in the river, it's incredibly clean. It's incredibly clean. In fact, our environmental study is on that website, so you can read if you are interested in all the details of that. It was pretty remarkable. The cool thing too is that a lot of the original bedrock that were there, the original bedrock and beautiful rocks, a lot of it is still in the river. So they took out the boulders, but a lot of that original bedrock is still there. And once we restore the rapids, you'll be able to actually see it.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah,
That's exciting.
yeah.
I'm excited about the completion of the bike trail, now that I'm too old to ride them. I can remember running into a brick wall near the old Panlin Hotel. Be nice to see a trail there. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Will that electric, that dam is gonna put in affect the travel on the river, the canoes?
How will it affect?
Yeah, so if it's a canoe, there will be a portage around it. So we'll still encourage people to portage around it, especially when it's in use and operating, but it'll be a very safe portage. Yeah.
The fish ladder is going to remain?
So we're gonna keep the historic fish ladder. So it is, we see it as a historic structure. So the fish ladder will stay, but the dam itself, the 6th Street Dam, will be removed. And if you haven't noticed this when you're down downtown. The 6th Street Dam, actually, there's a number of places in the dam that's already failing. So if you look closely when the river's not at an elevated level, and you can kind of see parts of the 6th Street Dam, you can see holes in the concrete, and you can see there are a couple of spots where there's a lot of water coming out that looks like it's kind of coming out in the middle of the dam. And so we have said for years, the dam is failing, we have no intent to fix it. And that has nudged our federal friends at the Army Corps to work with us to find an alternative. Because technically the city, it's weird how things happen. So the 6th Street Dam technically is the city's responsibility to fix, even though the federal government doesn't give us any money to do it. However, the property owners on each side of the river, they own up to the middle of the river. So for all of this work that we're doing, we have to get easements from every property owner. It's crazy. I know, it's really crazy. And do you know the 2 property owners that we had the worst time with?
No.
The post office and the Ford Museum.
Two federal entities,
Are you
yes.
kidding me? There's lots of funny stories with this project.
Anybody else that has an urgent question?
This isn't urgent, but the amphitheater
Yeah.
is part of the project.
Yeah, so it's part of the entire river corridor project, but it's a standalone project, and that will probably break ground on the amphitheater within the next 10 months.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's our plan. We plan to be doing construction next year, at least on portions of it. So right now, if you go downtown, Market Street is completely closed down. So one of the problems with that site where the amphitheater is gonna go is that we had a huge, huge trunk line that ran through the middle of that property. The trunk line, which carried water, was I think the total was like 22 feet. And like you could drive a truck through it. And so we're moving that trunk line from where the amphitheater is gonna go, and we're moving it out to the middle of the road on Market Street. And that's about like an $18 million project. So we had to do that project and get that done before that site could become buildable, because you can't build on a trunk line like that, right? So if there's repairs that you have to do, you have to be able to get to the trunk line, so you can't have a building or anything, really. That's why we park, trucks there. That's why we have a salt pile there. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Well, I'd like to thank Mayor Bliss for coming and for your excitement about this project. You may now turn your phones back on.